Welcome again. I'm Alan Dodds Frank from the Overseas Press Club in New York. And in conjunction with the Ford Foundation and Carnegie Mellon as our host, we are conducting these two panels on the future of cybersecurity and global journalism. And I'm happy to say that an old colleague of mine from the Washington Star, the late lamented Washington Star, David Shribman, who's now the executive editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, will get up off his Pulitzer Prize and moderate this panel. Here he is, the distinguished Mr. Shribman.
Thank you very much. Some of you may know the name David Ignatius. He was for several years in the Pittsburgh Bureau of the Wall Street Journal. Later became my friend and colleague on the Wall Street Journal, and he's a well-known novelist. Many of his novels have been adapted to television and movies, and he writes novels, spy novels. And his latest novel is coming out in about 6 weeks, and I read it last week. It's called The Director, and it's quite good. I won't tell you how it turned out because I'm not quite sure either. It was so confusing. But it kept my attention, and one of the things that kept my attention about this novel, which is basically about world war in the cyber age, is that, number one, no bullets were fired, and number two, no reporters were involved. This struck me as odd and disquieting, not the first, but the latter. And I haven't talked to David about this, but it struck me that the world of national security, and indeed the definition of national security and of journalism have been changed, and changed immutably in the past 18 to 24 months. They will change even more so and at an increasingly rapid pace in the next 18 to 24 months, I am sure. Let me introduce ever so briefly this distinguished panel, and we will examine these questions, who will help you examine these questions, and then we'll get to the video screen where we will speak to Mr. Wisner, who is the ACLU appointed lawyer for Edward Snowden. The panel here, to my right, and of course, many of you believe that almost everybody is to the right of the editor of the Post-Gazette. Besides Alan Frank, is Virgil Gilgore, who is the Scilab director here at Carnegie Mellon University. Then my friend David Harris, who is a Pitt Law School professor, distinguished professor at the University of Pittsburgh Law School, and my colleague Mark Rochester, who about a year ago joined the Post-Gazette as our deputy managing editor, and he is primarily responsible for digital issues. But before we hear from our panel locally, we're going to hear through the magic of technology, this being Carnegie Mellon, and this not being particularly magical anymore, from Ben Wisner, who is the ACLU attorney who represents Edward Snowden. I don't have to explain to any of you who Edward Snowden is or what he did and what he is doing. So here we go. Good evening, Mr. Wisner. How are you?
Hi, how are you? It's Wisner. I can hear you now.
Wisner. Well, there you go. No one ever pronounces my name right either the first time. And he's over there. And why don't you talk to us a little bit about Edward Snowden and the legacy of Snowden, the meaning of Snowden, and the implications for all of us, particularly journalists, of Edward Snowden.
Well, I will. I should tell you before I start that I have not heard a word that any of you have said by way of introduction. The first thing I heard was when you just addressed me.
Well, we've said nothing that you should be troubled about or feel the need to deny.
Okay. Nothing to rebut as of yet. Yeah. Okay. Well, I do think that one way of thinking about the really extraordinary events of the last 9 months is that, they are as much a story about journalism and investigative journalism as they are about privacy or cybersecurity. I think one of the common misperceptions about the Snowden affair is that he disclosed large numbers of documents to the public. The number of documents that Edward Snowden has shared with the public is 0. What he chose to do instead was to deliver very, very critical documents, documents that the public had a right to know and had a need to know, to journalists whom he selected, and his instructions to those journalists were that they should, in consultation with their editors and where appropriate in consultation with the U.S. government and other governments, use their expertise, use their tradition to decide what was in the public interest to share and to withhold what should not be withheld. This is, in a sense, what government sources do with journalists every day. They share information with them. Some of the information is intended for publication or for release. Some of that information is not intended for release. The difference with Snowden, obviously, is scale and proof and evidence that rather than just giving information, he was able to share, many, many thousands of pages of documents, and that he shared those not just with one news organization. And the reason for that is that he, along with the rest of us, saw what happened when only one news organization has this kind of information. In 2004, James Risen and Eric Lischblau of the New York Times had a bombshell story about warrantless NSA surveillance. And the New York Times, under pressure from the Bush administration, sat on that story for 14 months and only published it after an election when James Risen was going to, in any event, publish the information in a book. So what Mr. Snowden chose to do was to share it with multiple journalists so that they would, in a sense, be pushed by each other, have these news organizations essentially competing. And I think that, this is one of the real stories. I mean, you have an extraordinarily courageous individual like Glenn Greenwald who doesn't have the same deferential relationship to the security state as some other journalists do. But look at what his involvement did to institutions like the Washington Post, the New York Times, and others who, in order to be in the story, published, I think, some of the most aggressive articles that we have seen to date. So I do think that this has been a remarkable year for journalists because they have been much less willing, I think, than journalists have, at least in the last decade since 9/11, to accede to national security claims by the executive rather than to challenge them. And so I really commend all of the organizations that have been involved in the Snowden reporting, which is not to say that I agree with every single publication decision that is made, and nor does Snowden agree with every single publication decision that is made. People didn't notice that in Time magazine, when he was named the runner-up person of the year to the Pope, he was asked, do you agree with every decision that journalists have made? And he said, I don't. But that's precisely why I chose this model.
Professor, would you talk about the implications of Snowden's revelations, whether they've damaged the government and what are the consequences? Have the country's capabilities to defend against state-sponsored cyber warfare or to wage cyber warfare itself been compromised?
Which one of us?
You. Professor Gligor, yes.
Okay, thanks. Before I start, let me start with a disclaimer.
Yes.
In particular, I do not speak tonight for Carnegie Mellon University. I don't even speak for the lab I lead. And I must say that at this time, neither I nor my lab have any contracts with the NSA, CIA, or FBI, any research contracts. And
We say also that the Post-Gazette doesn't either, to our regret.
Excuse me?
We have no contact either, but to our regret.
No contracts. So no research contracts, and no proposals to get any research contracts. So if, God forbid, I say something good about these guys, that doesn't mean that I'm paid, right? Because I'm not. So now, in terms of Snowden's revelations, I must admit that for me, the revelations were a shock, but a shock that's probably not obvious to you. So the biggest shock that I had was not that there was massive collection of call records, because as I read to you earlier, we knew that since 2006, and we did not need Snowden to tell us that NSA collects massive databases of Americans' phone calls. I mean, this is USA Today, as I mentioned earlier. So this wasn't a shock at all. What was a shock is that NSA internally had such poor security controls. And the reason why that was a shock to me was that, as I usually tell people, is that NSA does not eat its own dog food. What that means in the trade is that you should practice what you preach. In particular, NSA wrote the book on so-called trusted facility management, namely how to manage facilities that process classified information. They even have guidelines on how to write manuals about trusted facility management. And this all happened since 1989. They have guidelines about audit. And clearly, many classified guidelines followed. And I'm intimately familiar with these things, basically because I wrote them for the NSA. This was in 1989, 1992. I must admit that I have not done work with them since about 1994, so I can't say anything that I wish at this point. So basically, this document showed how to separate duties, how to make sure that system security administrators and auditors were in balances and checks, how trusted system programmers who build the systems and back them up should not have any access whereas the system is actually operational. And all this were documented. We even had formal models for this, mathematical models for this stuff. And guess what? They used none of this in the Hawaii facility. Big shock. Secondly, the second big shock for me was that in the last 10 years, not just NSA, but the intelligence community in the United States has expanded its operations so fast, this is since 9/11, that they could not operate.
Ask Ben if he can hear you.
Ben,
Yes, I can hear you.
So they expanded so fast that they could not operate with regular government employees that went to a thorough security clearance, a thorough indoctrination about what access means and what privacy means. And they had to go to contractors. They have armies of contractors now, and that to me is a huge problem. Snowden was one of them. Now, he may have behaved in the same way if he was an NSA employee, so I'm not addressing directly his case at all. His case is actually irrelevant to my point. My point is this massive expansion without the ability to train, to educate, even to indoctrinate people as to what privacy is about, for example. The last shock that I had was the lack of formalized accountability. So what that means is that the accountability that NSA has, which is much more stringent than any of you believe, is fairly informal. Basically, they go to an incredible, severe indoctrination process about privacy, and they watch people reasonably well, and they notice violations. Yet, it's all self-imposed. In other words, the violations which happened in terms of privacy violations, I'm told by a member of the Presidential Commission, was all self-reported. NSA went to the court and reported them. Now, that's fine. That's perfectly okay, but that's not full accountability. That's discretionary accountability. Same thing with the FBI. When they broke the law and wiretapped people, as we are told in 2010 by this Washington Post article, it was discretionary. The FBI leaked the information. It wasn't the FBI going to the Inspector General of the Justice Department and reported. Voluntary. Somebody leaked, right? This to me does not make sense. In other words, if one gives these agencies so much power in terms of our privacy, then discretionary accountability is an unsuitable mode of operation. And for me to find it out was really a shock. I will also say a few things which are not a shock to me and are likely to be false. There was a question earlier about NSA bastardizing security standards. And I actually believe that there is very scant evidence for that. And here is why. And I think this is largely a misconception. I cannot be sure 100%, but here is my point of view. Some of the most frequently used standards in the United States in cryptography are international standards proposed by people coming from other countries, like Belgium. The advanced encryption standard, which is now very commonly used, was proposed by Johan Damon and Vincent Raymond. And NSA had no say. They're just one of the groups that did the evaluation of that, but absolutely all control over the standard was these two Belgian fellows. The hash function standard, which was just announced last year, guess what? Was proposed in Belgium and was evaluated in the United States. And NSA participated seriously in the evaluation and helped actually with weak hash functions. So they're extremely helpful. And clearly the Belgians won again. Now, there is a question about a random number generator standard, when in fact there is a secret parameter which has not been released. That I have a question about. However, that is not the largest problem we have. The largest problem we have in that area is that our pseudo-random number generators, which are absolutely key to all cryptography, their implementations in Android, in Unix, and in various systems is flawed. The implementation is flawed. So you can take a correct standard and make a mess out of it. By the way, the random number generator that Intel designed, which is extremely good, was partly designed, guess where? In Russia. So coming back to the question, is it possible that the NSA interfered to weaken the standards? Maybe, but I have very severe doubts that that interference has made a difference in the past or will make a difference in the future. We are our own worst enemy in that area. We don't need NSA to help. So I'm done. I'd like to let other people speak. So
I think we'll return to Mr. Wisner if you're there.
I am, although if you don't mind, it would be more interesting for me if I could hear everybody else first and then perhaps respond. If you want me to go now, I will.
Oh, sure, that's fine. That's fine. Let's go to Professor Harris, who's going to examine some of the legal issues fencing this discussion, including some explanation of the FISA court and why its secrecy may be a barrier to understanding by journalists, the public, and even much of the government.
Well, good evening, and I'd like to thank the organizers, Alan Frank and my friend David Tribman. I'm just going to say a few things about the FISA court, how it works, and what it does, and to comment a little bit about how I think it might be improved and what we could expect given the constitutional rules that we have. The FISA court is not new. It goes back to the 70s. Back in the 70s, those of you who are around then will remember the church committees, lots of problems with intelligence gathering, congressional hearings, and the FISA court was a legislated avenue to try to correct some of these abuses. It has been the case, the law has been, I should say, since the 70s at least, and arguably longer ago than that, that the Fourth Amendment, the protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, does not apply with the same standard for foreign intelligence operations as it does for domestic law enforcement. Now, we could agree or disagree about whether that should be so, but that is the law, and it has been for a long time. There is a lower standard for courts and for the government to meet when they're doing foreign intelligence work. Number two, the FISA court is directed towards foreign intelligence. That is supposed to be its bailiwick, and it is supposed to be the matters that it looks at. But it has always been with this lower standard than what we think of with the Fourth Amendment. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about the fact that the FISA court is secret. A a lot of discussion about the fact that the FISA court operates ex parte, a phrase meaning only one side is there. And a lot of discussion saying that the FISA court is a, quote, rubber stamp court. Let me address all of those things right now. Remember that for the most part, what the FISA court does is it decides whether or not to grant the government permission to do certain intelligence activities regarding foreign intelligence. And when the government is seeking that kind of permission to do those activities, it goes before the court, and those things are secret because if they were revealed, why do them? I mean, it kind of defeats the whole purpose for the most part. There may be some instances in which you would not need secrecy, but if you're going to have intelligence work, secrecy is part of the package. Now, if you went to a regular domestic court, you would find some of the same characteristics that you find in the FISA court. It wouldn't necessarily be secret, but applications for warrants, which are public records and so forth, they're not really done in a very open way. I mean, you can get access to those, but they're not done in hearings or anything. In regular domestic courts, it is an ex parte process too. In other words, only the police are there. So this is not a new thing with the FISA court. Number three, is it a rubber stamp court? And there have been, there's been discussion that they approve something like 99% of all of the applications that come before it. I wouldn't say that it's any different in that respect from what we have seen with regular domestic courts. When the government comes alone in the form of the police to get warrants, overwhelmingly, judges grant them. That's, you know, that's the way it is. They don't have anybody else there. Now, I think that's a problem. I'll come to that in a minute. But there is nobody to oppose them, and by the time they get to a judge, they've had to commit themselves on paper to a certain version of the investigation and the facts, and that creates some degree of caution. And so it's no wonder that they usually get what they ask for. Also, remember that even in domestic courts, non-intelligence courts, the standard is not that high for getting a warrant to do a search or a seizure. It is probable cause. Not proof positive, not beyond a reasonable doubt, but probable cause. Supreme Court doesn't quantify that for us. It is less than half of the amount of evidence, by far, okay? Probable cause. Now, that's not nothing. I don't mean to say it's nothing, but it's not the same as being able to prove the case, and yet you can still get a search warrant. As I told you before, the standard for this sort of request at the FISA court, because it involves foreign intelligence, is even lower. Now, the one thing that I think could be different there, one way that they could improve it, I like this idea I have heard back and forth about a privacy advocate or a devil's advocate or a person like that who would represent the public's interest in this court. It isn't done, as I've told you, in domestic situations where police are asking for warrants. So why do it here? I think, you know, very simply, the issues are too important to simply leave them all in one set of hands. There is too much public concern at this point. And since this is a court that is created by legislation, we can have new legislation that would put this kind of a position, make it part of the court's operation. So I would see that as a common sense, good thing to do going forward. Now, one more thing about how the Fourth Amendment operates in this sphere. Like many of you, I bet, I listened to Ed Snowden's interview with Mr. Wisner at South by Southwest. And he made some very interesting, provocative comments. I just want to talk about one right now. And that is, towards the end of his remarks, he said that the Fourth Amendment was being destroyed in the FISA court. And that it is being changed from you have to have a reasonable search and seizure to you can seize anything as long as you're searching it later. Now, I want to respond to that because it's not strictly speaking accurate, okay? And I want to be clear that the case I'm about to tell you about, I don't like. I am just telling you what the law is, okay? There's a case, again, going back several decades, called Smith versus Maryland. There are other cases that followed it. The impact of Smith versus Maryland is this. If you, as an individual, give your information to a third party, you no longer have an expectation of privacy in that information. All right? So, if I and this developed in some old technology, old surveillance technology called a pen register. Remember our old phones used to have dials, right? And you'd turn the dial and it would go click, 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 click. The pen register counted the number of clicks. So it could give a report of what number was dialed. You needed to have a warrant for this or not? That was the question in Smith versus Maryland. And what the Supreme Court said, and like I said, it's a mistake. I think this is a wrong decision, but it is a decision that is on the books still today. They said if you give your information to a third party, such as the telephone company, it is no longer private. Okay? Now that may not have hit a lot of people back in the 70s or 80s. And it may not have occurred to a lot of folks when the next case came along, which was about banking records. You're given all, you're using checks, you're having information sent through to the banks. You have no privacy interest vis-a-vis the government. But that is the law. It is a very bad, very dangerous decision, in my opinion, and I've been yelling about it for years. Nobody pays attention, of course. But now we can see, with this technology we have today, where that got us. Because everything we do in the digital world is all handed to intermediaries. Everything. The calls you make, the websites you browse, everything goes through an ISP, if not more than one. That means, under this case, you have given up your right to an expectation of privacy. And that is what has been used by the NSA, for good or for ill, I'll leave that to a later discussion, to justify the bulk collection program that it has been involved in. All right? One more point before I go. It is not correct, in my opinion, for us to say this is the fault strictly of the NSA. I want everybody to put themselves back about 10 or 12 years and try to remember what the general tone in the country was after 9/11. And what people were saying about passing the Patriot Act, and how we had an Attorney General go before the Senate and say that people who raised phantoms of lost liberty, those people were only aiding the terrorists. The Attorney General of the United States said that. Right? And what was the reaction at the time? You go. The public said, you do it. You go for it. You do whatever you have to do to make us safe. So here we are. They've done everything they can do, everything the technology enables them to do. Doesn't mean they should have, but they have. So we are involved in this too, not just as victims. And it's time for us to take it back and have the discussion that's now been prompted by Ed Snowden's revelations. So I'll stop here and wait for questions.
Let's go next to Mr. Rochester. And Mark, would you address the issues you believe that Snowden raises for ordinary citizens and for us in the journalism game?
Well, as David mentioned, I oversee the paper's digital efforts. I also overseen investigative reporting in various news organizations for about 20 years. So for me, one of the most striking things about the impact of this case is really the restraint and the responsible manner in which the major news organizations that pursued these stories used in reporting out this data. In an era when you have CNN on 24 hours a day talking about where this Malaysian plane may or may not be, there isn't a lot of restraint in the media. It's get it first, get it out there, and we'll worry about the consequences later. With these reports, I think for the most part we've seen journalists take their time, making sure they understood what this data meant, going out and getting knowledgeable, technical technology experts who could help guide the reporting and getting at the real essence of what these documents really meant. I think that's been an important part of this story. In terms of what this means for the average citizen, I think you have to know what your government is up to. By the same token, I'm probably more afraid of what some of these big box retailers learn about me for my internet activity than whether the NSA is spying on any of my reporters in terms of what they're doing. How many of us have had the experience of you go on Orbitz or Travelocity and you book a rental car, and a half hour later you're on Facebook and you start getting ads from rental car companies, and the amount of information that's out there that gets collected and then used for commercial purposes is only going to grow. The way that journalists pursue stories like this, I think is incredibly important in an era when there are fewer and fewer people watching what government does, government at all levels. There were references made earlier to police agencies making the same kinds of information requests that the federal government does. That's very true. I've been involved in investigative efforts where we were investigating the Pentagon, and we were investigating Iraqi prisoners of war being beaten and abused, and we would take a certain amount of caution in terms of how we pursued those stories and where we kept our investigative materials, but we never obsessed about, government agency X might be monitoring what we do. What happens with any investigative project is you go out, you do a certain amount of reporting, you wait till you feel you have critical mass, and then you go out and you confront the target of your investigation and you tell them exactly what you have and you try and get their reaction to it. If a government agency really wants to monitor everything we do, that's not going to really frighten most investigative journalists, because at some point I think we have the same obligation of transparency as the agencies that we investigate. So for me, one of the things you heard most often was that there would be a chilling effect of there'd be a chilling effect on sources, on whistleblowers, and that they would be afraid to come forward because of all the scrutiny that Snowden has, scrutiny and threats of imprisonment and perhaps worse. There would be a chilling effect from all this, and I don't really see that. I think the people you see engaged in whistleblowing activities, they are usually very passionate about what it is they're concerned about. They're usually very thorough and prudent about who they approach, in the same manner that he approached news agencies that he believed were vital in this effort. I don't think you're going to see any real negative impacts from this.
Thank you, Mark. Before we go to Mr. Wisner, let me just say that what we've heard in the last, say, 34 minutes is a discussion about the NSA, FISA, Smith versus Maryland, the notion that if you tell someone a secret, you have no expectation that that secret will remain so. We all know that from our own personal lives. The notion that we have to know what government knows and what Target and Travelocity know about us, and Mr. Wisner's intriguing point, if I can summarize it, Mr. Wisner, that there was nothing remarkable about what Mr. Snowden did. So do you want to pick up from that? You can contest that notion, or you can erase it?
Well, I think this is a remarkable discussion because that list of topics that you just laid out usually is not included in a single panel conversation. I've been at events with technologists who want to talk about the NSA's Bull Run program, the NSA's trade in zero-day vulnerabilities, the NSA's manufacture of vulnerabilities and hacking into backends, and talk about that from a technical standpoint. And I've been at many events where people want to talk about constitutional law and journalism, but to have all that in one panel is admirable. And so let me try to respond to some of the remarks that have been made. And let me start by, unsurprisingly, defending Edward Snowden's comments about the Fourth Amendment. Now, it is true that one of the rationales that the NSA has advanced for one particular program, which is the first program that was revealed, its collection on a daily basis of all telephone metadata from the phone companies and storage of that they have defended that in part on the basis of what was described as the third-party doctrine. That is that we waive any constitutional privacy interests in anything that we share voluntarily with any third party. But there's another argument that the NSA has advanced that I think is far more radical and has advanced it in litigation in which we're engaged. And that is that when the NSA, we would use in ordinary language, collects and stores all of this information about us, that isn't even collection at all until those databases are queried by a human being in search of another. They use the word interception for all of this information. It doesn't refer only to metadata. That they have conceded that their theory would apply just as much to content. That if they intercepted, or if their technologies intercepted the content of all of our phone calls, as long as they just stored it in a data facility and did not query that database in search of an individual, that the Fourth Amendment would not even be implicated in the first place. And that's what Ed Snowden was talking about. So those are two theories, both of which are extremely problematic. The latter, in fact, suggests that the NSA could collect and store all of the world's communications, including all Americans' communications, and the Constitution would have nothing to say about it. To me, this is the paradigm of what the framers of the Constitution considered a general warrant. That is that you collect information about all people so that you can then search it for guilty people. Those framers were more concerned about a government that had that power than they were about bad guys occasionally getting away, or even more than occasionally getting away. This is fundamentally a question of state power, and that I think is what Snowden was referring to in his remarks at South by Southwest. A comment about the FISA court. You may be surprised that I agree with much of what was said about the FISA court. There is nothing remarkable about a court that issues warrants meeting in secret with one side. That's what a warrant is. If you're going to conduct secret surveillance on someone, by definition, it has to be authorized in secret. I think where the FISA court really went astray was in the last decade. And that was when the court expanded its mandate far beyond just issuing warrants. And so what you saw was the court writing long opinions, 30 pages, 60 pages, 90 pages, in which the court was not issuing a warrant, but it was ruling on the legality and constitutionality of government practices. And this happened when the Bush administration nearly, had an internal revolt when the head of the FBI and the Attorney General threatened to resign over their warrantless wiretapping. They didn't end up stopping those programs. What they did is they brought them to the FISA court, and they asked the FISA court to rule on their legality and constitutionality. And since that time, and these opinions were not made public until after the Snowden revelations, this FISA court, without hearing from any adversary, only getting briefs from the government, was writing long opinions in which it evaluated whether the NSA's proposed activities were consistent with laws passed by Congress and with the Fourth Amendment. And to me, that is what is most dangerous. If you're going to have a court like that, that is actually going to consider the constitutionality of government action, not issue a warrant, it's outrageous that that court is only hearing from the party that is trying to do the surveillance when that court is not even set up to monitor whether the government is complying with it. As we heard, what we know about violations was self-reported. The government would come back to the FISA court and say, actually, what we did was outside of what you authorized. We're sorry. And you have some of these opinions from FISA court judges saying, this is outrageous. Don't do it again. And to me, one of the most significant results of the Snowden revelations is that it has actually revitalized democratic oversight in all three branches. So what we've seen is that some of these issues that were being decided in secret with one side by a court that was not set up to do this have now moved into ordinary federal courts in New York and Washington and San Francisco that hear from both sides, that have the benefit of full briefing, and the same programs that were, you don't have to use the word rubber stamps, but approved 15 out of 15 times are now being called by federal judges almost certainly constitutional, Orwellian, because these courts now have the benefit of adversarial briefing, and these debates are taking place in public. I also don't disagree that the NSA should not be singled out for blame right now, that the public has an enormous responsibility in a democracy if we're going to make these demands for safety and security. I do think, though, that the intelligence community has a lot to answer for, because it didn't just conceal from the public information that should not be concealed from the public in a democracy. It actually lied to the public about what it was doing. We all remember the infamous testimony of the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, before the Senate, when he was asked, is there any kind of surveillance that the NSA is conducting on millions of Americans, any records that are being collected? He said no. Now people say that he was lying to Congress, but Congress knew he was lying. He was actually lying to me. He was lying to you. We were the ones who didn't know about that until the Snowden revelations. And so it's not enough to say that the public shares the responsibility when the public is being systematically misled. I am less optimistic, I think, that the activity that we've learned about will not chill sources. I agree that it certainly has not chilled reporters. And as I said before, this is a year of incredibly courageous journalism in the United States and around the world. But I do think that what sources have learned about the government's metadata collection is certainly going to have a long-term effect. I think that reporters are getting savvier about it. That news organizations are hiring the kinds of security experts and technologists that they should have had before. They now see it as part of their ethical obligation to be able to provide source protection. But that's not going to be enough source protection. There's nothing, encryption doesn't solve the metadata problem. And government will know, if they want to know, who in government has communicated with the journalists if they're doing that electronically. And that's something that we do need to worry about. And finally, this audience knows much more than I do about the technology side, but I do think that one of the underreported in the mainstream press parts of the Snowden story, certainly not underreported in the technical press, is just about how much the intelligence community has prioritized offensive mass surveillance capability over cybersecurity and defense. And this is why I think it's important that the reporting has taken place in countries around the world. The NSA's bag of tricks is not going to belong to the NSA alone. These capabilities are in part a function of how much faster computers are getting, how much cheaper storage is getting, and mass surveillance is something that is going to be a tool available to any country, and not just a country like the United States. Now is the time for us to be getting the rules right for defense. As Snowden said at South by Southwest, the United States has a lot more to protect and a lot more to lose in a Wild West, unregulated, cyber warfare kind of world. And as Richard Clarke, who is on the President's NSA Review Board, testified in Congress just a few weeks ago, it's more important that we be able to protect our intellectual property from China than that we be able to hack into China and to steal theirs. Now is the time, and now there's a law and policy response to this problem, that there are policies that countries are going to have to agree on, but there's also a technological response to this problem. Because as we know, the way that the NSA conducts its mass surveillance is by identifying, creating, manufacturing vulnerabilities that are not the NSA's alone to use, and that are actually weakening communication systems and exposing us to threats from other countries and other kinds of malevolent actors. So I do think that is a really critical part of the story, and one that certainly people here at Carnegie Mellon are more familiar with than the general public.
Mr. Wisner.
So why don't I leave it at that?
Okay, and I want to address a question to you and then to the panel. I think it's possible to argue, Mr. Wisner, that Mr. Snowden's remarks at South by Southwest were themselves more poignant and themselves raised more questions than did his actions that led him to be invited to South by Southwest and to be the number 2 person for Time magazine and to be a figure known around the world. Given that, let me ask, as a journalist, and one who has not been chilled even in this cold winter, use the journalist's prerogative to take a complex issue and to oversimplify it beyond comprehension, and to ask you, why do you think that the establishment figures, many of whom embrace Daniel Ellsberg, revile Mr. Snowden? Does that trouble you?
Well, let me challenge the premise first, because as you remember and I don't, Daniel Ellsberg was not immediately embraced. Daniel Ellsberg was accused of being a Soviet spy, of having dropped off a copy of the Pentagon Papers at the Soviet embassy. The language that was used against him by the Nixon administration and by others in the early 1970s was just as colorful as the language that's been used against Edward Snowden. Let me make another point. At the very end of 2013, some 6 months after Snowden first revealed himself to the public, the most important, I would say, newspaper in the world, the New York Times, published an 1,100-word editorial, essentially calling for a clemency for Edward Snowden. There are large parts of the establishment that already see him as a whistleblower, if not a hero. There are people who claim to be running for president in 2016 who have called for clemency for Edward Snowden. So I might turn the question around and say, how is it that someone who gave many of the nation's secrets to journalists, who flew on a plane to Hong Kong and later ended up in Russia, enjoys such a solid reputation among some politicians, at least, not many, but certainly the mainstream media, and has so much support in the technology community? I don't know if you saw Mr. Snowden's appearance at TED last week by a telepresence robot, but virtually all the leaders of the tech community were tripping over themselves to be photographed with Mr. Snowden in this robot. So I actually think that it's because he's been so responsible, because he's been, methodical in the way that the information was released, because it's clear from his public statements that he's acting out of principle and not for his own gain. This is not someone who is going on every talk show to talk about himself. He has not been involved in a movie or book project. This is someone who clearly puts the public debate over his own safety. So, to me, the story is the opposite, so far at least.
Anybody in the panel want to jump in there?
I'll jump in. So, so I actually appreciate some of the actions that Edward Snowden took. In particular, the fact that he released his information to journalists. I thought it was a perfect strategy, and in fact, I think it was a very good idea. So the journalists acted impeccably. I just returned from the UK, where I found out that The Guardian withheld a large amount of information that Snowden gave The Guardian at the request of the British government, who probably did it at the request of the US government, if they didn't do it on their own. And so did the New York Times and the Washington Post. So in that sense, if he was a whistleblower, he actually did the right thing. Now, having said that, there is a huge difference between Daniel Ellsberg and Edward Snowden. And the huge difference is this. Ellsberg faced the music like a man. He was tried, he was judged by everyone, and he was here. He did not hightail out of this country to guess who? China? Russia? Are you kidding? I mean, just to give you another example why his judgment is incredibly bad. He could have gone to Brazil, who's very mad against the US no extradition treaty, has two incredible beaches, Copacabana and Ipanema, and guess what? They invented the string bikini and the caipirinha. In spite of all that, Snowden goes to Russia. I don't think that there is any comparison between him and Daniel Ellsberg in that sense. Ellsberg faced the music, Snowden
I think
didn't.
Mr. Wisner deserves the right of reply here.
I think so. Very brief, and I understand that people have strong opinions about this issue, and I don't expect to persuade. I will say that when he made his decision to go to Hong Kong, he didn't have the benefit of advice from anyone. He was 29 years old. He was on his own. He was doing the best he could. He wanted to be in a place where the U.S. would not be able to get to him. Having been in the CIA, he was worried not just about his freedom, but about his safety. And he thought that Hong Kong offered a good combination of a place that respected free expression, but where the U.S. Would not be able to cause him any immediate harm. Maybe he should have gone to Brazil. Maybe that's what I would have advised him. I didn't get to meet him at that point. As for Russia, At that point, he was trying to get from Hong Kong to Ecuador. The only way to fly from Hong Kong to Ecuador without landing in a country that has an extradition treaty with the United States was to fly to Moscow and then to Havana. And as we all know, he didn't make it past Moscow. His passport was invalidated by the United States. And he ended up stranded in the transit zone in Moscow for 39 days, during which time he applied for asylum in more than 20 countries. So I think it's fair to question his judgment for going to Hong Kong. It might even be fair to question his judgment for trying to leave Hong Kong. It's not fair to say that he chose Russia. And I think at this point, if any other country would allow him safe passage to go there, he would go.
He'll be in Ukraine next. I want to get to Professor Harris.
Yeah, I don't want to so much compare Snowden to Daniel Ellsberg as I do want to engage on the question of Mr. Snowden's public standing. It is true that he has, amongst certain communities, what he's done. He's looked at. I'll use Mr. Wisner's word, a hero. But I think the picture is a lot more nuanced than that when you look at what has actually happened. And that's all that is to say, is that I can't buy that entirely. I think he has done some very good things in getting this discussion out in the open and started and well along. We have needed this discussion for a long time about this kind of government surveillance. He has also, through these disclosures, forced the various tech companies, something we really haven't talked about yet, which are really our own as individuals, our ports of entry into the cyber world. He has forced them to up their game on security. Without his revelations, they just keep on doing the sloppy stuff they've been doing for years and not securing us and not seeing to our privacy. Because their business model is frankly stronger and better for them when they don't do that. So good things have happened. My problem, I think, is that the disclosures seem to have been rather indiscriminate. There seems to have been a lot of information taken, and it's still dripping out, one thing at a time, week by week. I don't think you can call him a hero, certainly, until you know everything that's going to come out. I mean, we are far from that point. There's a new story every week. We also know that there has been some compromise. I don't know how much, I'm not an expert in these things, but some compromise on our ability to use intelligence for the things that I think we would agree on, which is to fight our real enemies. Not Americans and their phone calls, but real, honest-to-God enemies in this world, and we have them. So if we were using methods to surveil the Taliban or to look into Pakistan in some of the dangerous areas there, into Iran, which we were, those methods, the day after they were disclosed, were not as useful to us. That's the best you can say. So I think it's at best premature and probably just a much more mixed picture than calling him a hero. This guy's done some good things by blowing the whistle, but there's a lot more to the picture, and I'm not surprised that a lot of people react a different way.
Alan, do you want to add something, and then I want to go to Mark?
I thought Ben would want to answer that, but I'll just add two seemingly unrelated questions. One, given the current events of the last week, what is Mr. Snowden's state of mind about the relations between Russia and the United States and how that might affect him? And second, which goes to somewhat to what David was talking about, and that is, what would be you've been touting his restraint and judgment, which certainly has been in evidence, but what would be the consequences of all the documents he had actually hit the internet?
Well, there's a lot of questions in there to respond to. I will say that I am not at all as certain that any of these published articles have burned a useful capability rather than just educated the public. And if they did, that reflects a poor judgment on the part of the newspapers and their editors for publishing it. I can say that not a single story has yet been published involving a Snowden document that did not involve consultation between those reporters and their editors and the U.S. government and often the British government. That's not to say that the reporters have always, or even most of the time, acceded to the requests, but they have in many of those stories removed information that they agreed with the intelligence community would cause harm to national security. It always does make me wonder, what they want us to think terrorists actually do. Did the Taliban not think that we were trying to intercept every possible communication of theirs? I mean, Osama bin Laden was living in a compound that didn't have a telephone wire running into it. That's one of the ways that we were able to find him, because they had already been sent back to the age of using couriers. Does it harm our national security even if it's true that terrorists stop using email and cell phones? I think you could argue just as well that it helps our national security if we force them off of modern communication and back to that kind of era. But I do think that these are judgments that the world's leading journalists and their institutions have been making. It doesn't mean that they'll get every single one right, but I do go back to the fact that Snowden himself has elected not to publish or disclose a single document. I won't get into his state of mind, but Alan, in response to your question, certainly he didn't think it was a good idea for all of the information that he gave to journalists just to be published on the internet. If he thought that was a good idea, he would have published it. It was necessary to give journalists information that shouldn't be published in order for them to understand the information that should be published. These are not all beautifully written RAND memos like the Pentagon Papers. As you all know, these are PowerPoints and these are diagrams. This is very, very complex information, and often for a reporter like Bart Gellman and his the technologists working with him to figure out that the NSA is hacking into transmissions between data centers overseas, they need to look at 16 different documents and then talk to a bunch of sources. There's not a memo that spells that out. And so that partially explains why more information had to be provided to journalists than even Mr. Snowden would have thought appropriate to publish.
Now, Mr. Rochester, let me go to you for a moment. Given all that you've heard, are you more worried about the NSA or about Travelocity in your daily life?
No danger of oversimplification there. I do have more concerns about commercial invasion of our privacy than what the NSA may or may not be doing. I think we all should be concerned about that. In the first panel, there was a discussion about the most effective nation states that are involved, and I won't give my own my own interpretations of that. But there are foreign governments that have entire departments that are devoted to trying to hack into U.S. Companies and steal their secrets. There's also a fairly elaborate niche industry that has grown up trying to prevent that. And the more this arms race kinds of builds up, I think it raises concerns for all of us. I think in terms of to go back to the other question about why do some consider Snowden a hero or not? I think we've seen these kinds of overreactions and corrections before. In the 80s, when there was violence in pretty much every major American city because the drug war was spilling out into our streets, city after city started passing or allowing their police departments to implement, more aggressive community policing policies or stop and search policies, stop and frisk policies. The response was kind of do whatever it takes to keep us safe from these drug gangs, and we'll worry about the civil rights violations later. The more that went on, I think the more communities responded, well, maybe we've gone a little too far. Maybe we should rein this in. I think we're seeing this same kind of thing, that after 9/11, yeah, there was pretty much a whatever it takes to keep us safe, do what you need to do. And I think we're starting to see that kind of pushback, and we meant to keep us safe, but we still want to preserve the democracy that we have. And so I think as we learn more and more, I think there will be more and more pressure to maintain our core beliefs, but still pursue the job of keeping us safe.
Before I get to Professor Harris, I want to ask Mr. Wisner a quick question.
Yeah, I also would like the chance to respond to whether the NSA is more dangerous than Travelocity, but go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, this is related, so I'll give you, you can make
Yeah.
a two-part answer.
Yeah.
Do you agree that the Snowden revelations, or the revelations that grew out of the Snowden material, kind of were a warm-up or made Americans more likely or gave context to, say, what happened at Target and the dangers that they may be facing from corporate surveillance or corporate interference or corporate knowledge of their every move?
Well, I think the first thing to say in response to that is that the question of corporate collection and the question of government collection can't be entirely separated. What we've learned about how the NSA and the government get information is that they use corporate collection very, very effectively, either by going in the front door with an order under the PRISM program or the FISA Amendments Act and saying to Facebook or Google or one of these other companies, please turn over all your content for a particular customer, or by going in the back door. By either in an upstream program tapping into the backbone of the internet, or even hacking into the transmissions between data centers overseas in order to engage in bulk collection. So one of the first points that I would make about this is just that there is not a strict line, and if we didn't know that before, we know it now, between corporate collection and government collection. The second thing I would say is that the danger of mass surveillance is not primarily, I think, about what the NSA is doing today. I have heard some people say that the Snowden revelations show that our democracy has already been undermined, that we're already not a free society. But I think that is fundamentally at odds with the way that most of us experience this society. It is not East Germany in the 1960s. It's a remarkably free and open society by any historical standards. The danger of mass collection is what might happen to that information. And my concern about this is that bulk data is not terribly useful as a predictive tool if the idea is to locate one terrorist who's going to do something. There just is not enough terrorism for it to work that way. On the other hand, bulk data is extremely useful as a forensic tool. And this information in the hands of law enforcement, for example, would help them solve many, many, many crimes because it's effectively a surveillance time machine. And so what we're going to see is that this information, the collection of which is justified as a counterterrorism measure and held by the NSA, is going to be made available to the DEA, is going to be made available to the FBI, is going to be made available to fusion centers and Joint Terrorism Task Force. And very soon, the cop on the corner with a handheld device is going to have access to this information. And the reason for that is because of how useful it is. If you collect all of the dots will always connect in hindsight. If there's any kind of catastrophic event, we will have in a data storage facility in Utah the information that could have prevented it if those dots were put together, and therefore the rules that limit sharing or use are going to be blamed for the attack, just the way the wall between intelligence collection and criminal collection was blamed erroneously, I think, for 9/11. Our main concern, again, with bulk collection by the NSA is not about today, it's about tomorrow.
Mr. Harris, you seem to want to have something to say.
I'll yield to Professor Lieber.
So I want to address the question as to whether or not Ed Snowden's revelations weakened NSA's ability to function or not. Now, I don't think there is any doubt that Snowden's revelation made NSA's life a lot harder. Now, whether or not that's good or bad we can argue about. But technically, their life is harder. And I can give you examples which you'll not hear from the NSA. So one example is as follows. Suppose that I'm a terrorist and I want to talk to my buddies. How do I do it? Well, I'm going to buy 50 cell phones, and every one of us in the same group will buy 50 cell phones. And I'm going to use these cell phones randomly in calling other of my buddies. Now, how is NSA going to figure out who's talking to whom when now they can only trace 2 hops? Right? This is as a consequence of the revelation and as a consequence of the recommendations of the Presidential Commission. President Obama basically told the NSA, now you can only collect 2 hops. If I'm going to increase my capability as a terrorist from 1 phone to 50, which is not that expensive, I might add, then NSA life is going to be a lot harder. Number 2, I, as a terrorist, I'm going to start using anonymous networks, namely networks which are designed in such a way that if anybody taps a line anywhere in between, they'll get nothing. As a matter of fact, we have a network which resembles an anonymous network, which is funded, by the way, by the Department of Defense, called Tor, the Onion Ring, which is not great, but it's pretty good. Well, guess what? If terrorists are going to use anonymous networks, NSA life is going to be very, very hard. Not that they won't be able to collect records at endpoints, right? I mean, our research here at Carnegie Mellon shows that if you have a perfectly anonymous network, we could collect records at endpoints, we at Carnegie Mellon, right? So we published those papers before Snowden was known to anyone around here. But the point is that, so NSA can do that, right? If we can do it, so they can, particularly if it's published knowledge now, but they cannot do it at scale. In other words, collecting call records and scale now, even with our techniques, becomes much, much harder. So finally, bulk data is important, unlike Mr. Snowden believes and Ben. Why is it important? Well, the reason why it's important is because what you want to do, you want to figure out the strength of relationships between people. Not simply that 2 people called each other. And to determine the strengths of relationship between 2 people, you cannot just collect the calls between those 2 people. What research has shown that you have to collect more than just the relationship between the 2 people. You have to collect the third party. So in other words, you don't collect only the frequency of the calls, the reciprocity, the recency, but there has to exist a third party in between to make the relationship strong, right? So consequently, in order to figure out the strengths of relations between groups, you have to collect a lot more than just merely 2 calls. You have to collect intermediaries as well. Now, that's the reason why NSA is collecting bulk data, because they want to do analysis to determine the strength of the relationships, not just the relationships. The problem is that if you don't collect bulk record, you will not know what questions to ask of the FBI to whom you turn over the data, or the CIA to whom you turn over the data. I mean, these folks at NSA do not do any law enforcement. They do intelligence. They get tasking from a lot of other agencies in the United States, and they produce the data and the limited analysis they do, and somebody else does the investigation and the further analysis. So unfortunately, and this pains me, I have to admit that bulk data collection has its role. It's unfortunate. We need a lot more accountability. Accountability should not be discretionary. And in that sense, I think we all agree. But bulk data collection is actually, unfortunately, necessary. I would like to say a few words, not now, but in a few minutes, about the relationship between surveillance by private companies like Google, Facebook, and the rest versus NSA.
Yeah, I want to pick up a point that Ben made. I think it's tremendously important to understand what he said. The problem is in the future, okay? And I want you to think back to the fall of 2001 when we were debating briefly the Patriot Act, not much, but we did a little bit, and we were assured through language in the statute this would only be for the war on terror, only be for foreign intelligence, only be for those purposes, these new investigative tools, these greater powers for our government. Comes the time when we're about to renew or not, because some of those provisions in the Patriot Act had sunset provisions, so we came to that point, and I remember clearly, we got lots of stories out of law enforcement. Hey, guess what? These tools are so great, we broke a child porn ring with it. These things are so great, we did a massive investigation of money laundering at a Las Vegas strip club, on and on. So once this stuff is out there, and once the utility of the information is out there and realized by law enforcement, it is really hard to get back in the bottle, all right? That was the great danger of the expansion of these powers without any real discussion or debate. And it's going to be hard to get it back. We are now having that discussion, and we may be able to retain or get back some of it, but it's not going to be easy. And to the extent it's out there, I would just quote Justice Robert Jackson, it lays there like a loaded gun, all right? It is ready to be used by someone. You may trust the people who are in government now, but they're not going to be there forever.
Now, we're going to take questions from the audience. You know, this conversation was remarkable in many respects, in part because the comments from Mr. Wisner and our panel have propelled us within 3 minutes of the ending zone of our conference here. So given that this conversation is about breaking the rules, I'll ask your indulgence if we can break the rules and go an extra 18 minutes, all the way up till 8 rather than ending at 7:45. Mr. Wisner, if you could make yourself available, and if the rest of you would also, I'd like to see if there are any questions from the audience. And press the button if you do. And if you don't, I got plenty of questions for the audience. Well, while we're preparing for that, I think Professor Gligor wanted to talk about commercial surveillance.
Right. So a number of commercial companies like Google, Facebook, and the like have a motto, which is privacy kills the internet. So essentially, the idea is that if your business model is to give free services for advertising, you will really need a lot of private information to tailor the advertising. And if you don't have that, you cannot offer free services, therefore the internet would be killed. Now, under that banner, they collect an enormous amount of information about our behavior. In fact, we are absolutely unique, completely unique as far as these companies are concerned, even though they do not have to know our names. They know our behavior. And they know our behavior in multiple dimensions. Our political views, our purchase behavior, whether or not we hesitate when we purchase or we go directly, our sociological data, including marital status and the like. So the idea is that these companies have a lot more information than the NSA or the FBI will ever have about us. Why? Because if FBI, I'm talking about inside the United States, I don't mention CIA because presumably they don't work here. They work elsewhere, hopefully. But the FBI and NSA, as we found out, they do work within the United States. And the point is that if they did the same thing that these commercial companies do, they'll all be in jail, right? Because they'll be violating so many laws that they'll all be in jail. Yet there is no concern on the part of the public so far with the privacy the threats to privacy posed by commercial companies in the advertising age. And
Questions?
If nobody wants to ask a question, let me ask Ben a follow-up to that, because I think that when Mr. Snowden talked to South by Southwest, he was saying that one of the remedies, or maybe that's too strong a word, but an improvement would be to trust this data to third-party companies, which would include the phone companies, et cetera. I'd like you to explain that, because I find it hard to believe that he would say that, considering the scope of what these companies do, as the professor just outlined.
I don't think he said that. It could be that I was so focused on something else that I didn't hear it, but it would go remarkably against everything else that I've ever heard him say. Now, he does think that there's a significant difference between governments collecting information and, in general, private companies collecting information, simply because governments can deprive us of life and liberty, and companies largely just try to deprive us of property, that is, all the money in our wallets. And that is a significant difference. Companies cannot share information with drone operators, nor can they put us on a no-fly list or a watch list based on information that they have. So I think he was making that general point. He certainly does not support proposals that are out there that would simply just transfer the NSA's bulk collection of telephone metadata, for example, to phone companies and require them to store it for longer than necessary. Now, this is going to be a really challenging problem in an era where the company's business model, as the professor said, is organized around collecting and retaining this data. But I do think that there is some middle ground here. The companies don't have to retain it forever. It's possible that they can effectuate their commercial purposes without retaining data forever in case they come up with some other valuable use for it in the future. And I do think that there will be more consumer awareness of that problem.
15 doesn't allow forever.
Else in the audience? Otherwise, I have a final question. Oh, you do. Go ahead, sir. Mr. Rochester.
You're mentioning the difference between.
Can you turn on your mic?
Press the button.
I have to hold it. You mentioned the difference between worrying about the commercialism versus the terrorists. I mean, as a consumer, I don't really get up every morning, and maybe I should, but I don't worry about terrorists. What bothers me the most is that I get phone calls every night trying to get to purchase this and purchase that, and the ads and stuff like that I get in the mail. So I tend to somewhat agree with you that things that bother me more are probably the commercial surveillance and collecting all the data. When you go to buy a washer and dryer and they ask you for your address, I have no idea what they do with it. I assume I'm going to get more magazines and stuff. So from my perspective, I tend to agree. Maybe I should worry more about terrorists, but but Best Buy bothers me more.
Well, that's only going to get worse in the future. I mean, you hear these proposals that Comcast is getting is forming partnerships with these big data companies. Well, why do you think they want to do that? They want to install the security system in your house, and so they want to know everything about your daily routine. They want to sell you more products. It's I don't think it's a future. I don't think it's a future we can avoid. I think we just need to be more aware of those kinds of data collection efforts. I mean, how many of us download apps every day on our phones without ever reading the disclosure statements? I do it every day. I've just gotten used to it. But I have no idea what they're going to do with that information. I've just sort of weighed the risk of, well, I really want this app. We sort of trained ourselves to we sort of trust these companies, although we have no idea who they are. I think we just need to sort of remind ourselves that, we sort of have to keep an eye on who's collecting this data and what they might use it for.
If I could respond just briefly, why could we not have a model for internet companies and business where it wouldn't be free, but I would pay $5 a month for assured security and privacy to some degree? I'm for that. I mean, that technology has to exist or could be built. And I think the more people realize how vulnerable they are, it's a business opportunity for somebody to step up You know, be a subscription and payment service instead of free, but we sell your data.
Of course, the telecommunications industry is also a very powerful lobby, and I'm sure any effort to do that would get killed.
Final question back there in the back row there. Yes, sir.
Okay. Do I? Okay.
Cannot hear you.
You can do it the old-fashioned way and just yell the question if you'd like.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now, repeat it.
My question is, with the Snowden revelation, it limited what the NSA can recover and can do, but has that acted as a catalyst for them to develop new and better ways of collecting the information?
You get that question?
Yeah. So.
Okay, did the NSA revelations prompt new, further innovations in collecting data? Is that basically it?
Yeah, did the
Right, so-
Snowden's revelation act as a catalyst to have the NSA develop new, improved, and better ways of collecting information?
I think maybe Professor Gligor might be the best person to answer that.
So my understanding of your question is that that if you buy my argument that NSA lives is harder now, won't this mean that they'll come up with new techniques? Well, it turns out that there are some limits to the techniques that they can come up with. As I mentioned already, if we have perfectly anonymous networks, God's anonymous networks, they could still do some collection of calls by figuring out, by using the fact that the endpoint communication devices have side channels and leak information. The problem is that that's not scalable. The technique is not scalable. At that point, you are limited, right? So clearly, there will be new techniques as new technology evolved, not because of the Snowden revelations, but because technology evolves, there will be new techniques to collect data. And naturally, NSA angels, everybody else, like us, for example, we would exploit those techniques. But there is no doubt that life is harder now. And basically, there are some limits to how much NSA could do in face of these basic defensive technologies.
I'm going to give the microphone over to our host, Mr. Alan Dodds-Frank, and you can wrap things up, Alan.
David, thank you so much, and thank you to the audience for being here. You've really been very attentive and alert, and I hope you've enjoyed it. It's been a marathon. Ben Wisner, really like to thank you for joining us and spending so much time with us, giving us a lot of insight into your client and the big issues that are affecting this country. And I think I'd like everybody to join me in a round of applause for our marvelous panel. Mark Rochester, David Harris, Virgil Gligor, and of course the unmatched Mr. David Shribman. Thank you. And there's still some food left, I think, if you'd like it.